All right, welcome to Chapter 8, Investigations. So, forensic psychologists can be involved in investigations by helping to identify suspects. Now, this could include narrowing down categories and lists of possible suspects. We see this often with profiling. Profiling is much more useful as an investigative tool. They can apply psychological science to how we interview witnesses and suspects by helping to structure lineups and show ups, and accumulating psychological and personality data from past crimes and applying that to help categorize suspects, motives, and MOs. So, again, that's basically criminal profiling. So let's talk a little bit about fingerprints. Fingerprints have been used for a variety of uses dating back to ancient pottery, where basically someone's fingerprint served as like your brand label, almost like what we would use for a logo today. They've been used as signatures for populations that couldn't read or write. And under Hammurabi, those who had been arrested were fingerprinted. In China, as early as 300 in the Common Era, handprints were used as evidence in trials, and Chinese officials impressed their fingerprints in clay seals, which were used to seal documents. Now, when paper gets invented, handprints are placed on documents. In 1858, Sir William Herschel, who's an English administrator in India, begins placing inked palm impressions and then later thumbprints on some members of the local populations on contracts. So again, when someone is illiterate, they can't sign, they can't write their name, they're using their palm print or thumb impressions. Now in 1880, Dr. Henry Folds, he's working in a hospital in Tokyo, he writes an article saying that fingerprints could be used as a means of identification. Printer inks could be used to obtain fingerprints, and he began studying skin furrows in the 1870s. So he's basically credited with the first fingerprint identification. And he describes two patterns that we see on fingerprints today, loops and whorls. And he correctly concluded that fingerprints do not change and that fingerprints left behind on surfaces could lead to the identification of criminals. So we've been using fingerprints for, a really long time. Now, in 1892, Sir Francis Galton publishes a book called Fingerprints, and he was mainly interested in how fingerprints could be used to help determine our heredity and our racial or really ethnic background. And he proved that no two fingerprints are exactly the same and that prints do not change over time. Although I do want to put a little caveat in here that we actually haven't really examined this. There's a lot of scientific evidence that gets used in court that we haven't actually properly tested scientifically to know for sure if that's an accurate way of identifying someone. And despite the fact that we use fingerprints all the time, we don't actually know for sure that people don't have the same fingerprints. He says the odds of two individual fingerprints being the same were 1 in 64 billion. And he starts classifying fingerprints by their shape, where they're positioned in the finger, and relative size. Right, so now we have the loop and the whorl that we already knew about, and the arch. Okay, and then these can be, take on various shapes, as you can see in the second photo. Now, at the same time, an Argentinian police officer named Juan Bechutek devises his own system of classification, the Galtian method. And this is 101 types of fingerprints based on Galton's incomplete taxonomy. And it was successfully used in 1892 in a case of Francisco Rojas. In 1897, Sir Edward Richard Henry devises a workable fingerprint classification system that's being used in India. In 1901, he's appointed Commissioner of Scotland Yard, where he begins to introduce his fingerprint system. And the Henry classification system is the uniform way of identifying fingerprints in the English-speaking countries around the globe. Now, how do we actually collect fingerprints? Okay, so the study of fingerprints for the purpose of making identifications is dactyloscopy. So latent prints, right? When we have fingerprints, like look at the surface of your phone, you'll see it's probably covered in your fingerprints. They're the result of the contact of our sweat pores that are on the ridge surface of a finger. Okay, when they come into contact with the surface, an oily deposit or residue is transferred to the surface. That's what makes the fingerprint that we're able to collect and then compare to fingerprints that you might have on file somewhere, to see if they match you. So at the crime scene, we have to look at all our surfaces and photograph and collect any visible fingerprints. Now we can collect them in a variety of ways. The way that you guys are probably used to seeing is like in a TV show where someone dusts it with a fine powder. Okay, the powder adheres to the oily substance that allowed you to leave the fingerprint behind, and then that can be lifted with fingerprinting tape, and it transfers a mirror image. Okay, so you want to photograph that, and then you want to dust it and then lift it. Now, episcopic coaxial illumination, there's a fancy term for us, can be used for prints on smooth, non-porous substances, glass, plastic, polished metal, surface of your phone. You can use a semi-transparent mirror to observe the reflection of light perpendicular to the surface. Okay? There's also methods, super glue is used to lift some kind of prints, right? So it really depends on the surface that you want to lift the print from. Iodine, silver nitrate, lasers, etc. Right? So lots of interesting scientific ways to lift fingerprints. So then we want to compare it, right? We want to see, does this match anybody who has fingerprints anywhere on record with a federal agency? Do fingerprints, match a suspect whose fingerprints you've just taken? So they used to be compared physically, right? And it could take a long time to compare that. Today we use a computer, right? We use a system, AFIS, and then the integrated automated fingerprint identification system, and then the final match is made by eye, right? So it's made by a person. So in 1991, not 19,991, AFIS was developed, and it's the largest biometric database in the world. It has fingerprints and the corresponding criminal history of more than 55 million people. Okay, so your local, your state, your federal agency has lifted prints or has taken your prints for something. So if you have had some jobs where you've worked with kids, you might have had your fingerprints taken. I've had my fingerprints taken for 2 jobs, and you can also then have them taken, if you apply for TSA PreCheck, you'll also have them taken for that as well. So your fingerprints may be on record somewhere. So whatever agency is taking your prints, right, they may be voluntarily submitting these prints to AFIS, and that allows us to provide automatic fingerprint search capabilities. Okay. Usually you get a response in about 2 hours for non-criminal investigations, right? So you're being investigated. You'd also be fingerprinted if you have a license to carry here in Massachusetts, right? Those take a little bit longer. They take 24 hours. Obviously, we prioritize searches for criminal cases over civil uses. So fingerprint analysis is not infallible. First of all, when we lift your prints at a scene, the odds that they're like pristine, completely clean prints, the way when your prints are taken on purpose, is not very high. So we don't have a required number of points matching in order for somebody to say, oh, these are the fingerprints at this crime scene belong to Meredith Spencer. So it's up to the individual expert examiner to determine that based on their training, skill, and expertise. The FBI stated once in a terrorist attack in 2004 that they found 15 matching points. Spanish authorities said there was no match. They only found 7 matching points. Turns out the FBI was wrong, and the correct suspect was someone else who was found using DNA. So this is what we mean when we say we have a lot of methods, scientific investigation techniques that we use in the criminal justice system without it being as scientific as you'd think it would be. So one thing that happens here is confirmation bias, right? We tend to notice and look for what confirms our beliefs and ignore things that don't confirm those beliefs. And so those errors result from the way the brain processes information and makes decisions. Right? So sometimes we see a pattern where there isn't really a pattern because we're ignoring other pieces of evidence. Voice identification. So Hoffman was electrocuted in 1936 for the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby, based on a voice identification 3 years after the fact. Now, at the time, there's no experts in voice identification, but this leads to research on the topic. And in 1937, McGee found that subjects could accurately identify a voice 83% of the time within 1 to 2 days. So say I've called you and I've said some threatening things to you, and I then get arrested, and the only method they have for you to identify me is by voice. You can accurately do that most of the time within 1 to 2 days. But after 3 weeks, the odds are basically just like chance. So voice identification, not really solid science. Now, the first factor in identifying a voice and its uniqueness lies in the size of our vocal cavities, right? So what is the structure of our throat, our nose, our oral cavities? What's the shape and length and tension of our vocal cords? And the likelihood that all those things are going to be the same in two people is very remote. Now, the second factor is the manner in which our muscles of speech are manipulated during speech. So our lips, our teeth, our tongue, and soft palate and jaw muscles. And the likelihood of all of that being identical to someone else is very remote. So the first step in voice identification is to evaluate the recording of the unknown voice to make sure there's sufficient speech to work with and that the quality of the recording is sufficiently clear. Second step is to check the samples of the subject. So we have a voice recording, a message maybe I've left on your answering machine, your voicemail. And then the second check is I've been arrested and you've taken a sample of my voice, right? We have to make sure both of those are sufficient in order to even attempt a match. Okay? And then the speech samples must be the same as the text of the unknown recording. So whatever's been said on your voicemail has to, the sample that's taken from the suspect has to match. Now you can visually compare the voice sample using a spectrographic analysis, right? So this is sound wave analysis. And there's 1 of 5 standard conclusions. Yes, these two match. Yes, they probably match. Absolutely, they don't match. They probably don't match, or we can't tell. So a positive ID requires a minimum of 20 speech sounds that possess sufficient oral and spectrographic similarities. Now, what do we know about ear witnesses, right? So we know a little bit about eyewitness. We know that it's not great, right? But what about if someone hears something? Not a lot of research on this. The FBI did a survey of 2,000 forensic cases, and they found an error rate of 31% for false identifications. So 31% of the time, someone falsely identified someone as a suspect, and 53% of the time for eliminating someone, right? So look at that. That 53%, that's like chance. Now, unprepared participants are less likely to recognize the speaker, and voice recognition improves the longer the sample is, which just makes sense, right? The longer you've had to hear somebody, right? People that really well, that you talk to all the time, you recognize their voice, right? They call you on the phone, say you don't have caller ID, you'd be able to recognize who they are. So this could be allowed into evidence in states that follow the Doe-Bear standard. But it usually requires some additional precautions, and we should really be reluctant to identify somebody or convict somebody based on ear witness testimony. Polygraphs. Okay, so if you guys go up for a federal job or even some local law enforcement, you may be required to undergo a polygraph. So this has been in existence for nearly a century. Now, it's important to remember that a polygraph can't actually detect when you're lying. It's measuring body responses that we tend to have when we're lying, okay? So it isn't really like, boom, that's a lie. It's measuring, do you get anxious? How does your breathing pattern change? How does your blood circulation change? How does your blood pressure change, right? That's what it's measuring. And so there's really crude versions of this. nearly back to the beginning of the Common Era. Um, People would be asked to lick a hot iron, right? And a tense, nervous person would have less saliva and therefore be more likely to have their tongue burned, right? You kind of got to laugh at some of this early stuff. Like, these are the weird things we're doing to determine someone's guilt, or like having to lick a hot iron to prove you're innocent. Well, in 1878, Angelo Mawson uses a plethysmograph to study the effects of emotion, right? So fear. Like, how does fear affect our breathing, affect our heart rate? And that's basically what we're using in a lie detector. So in 1914, Vittorio Benussi invents a method to calculate the quotient of inhalation to exhalation as a means of verifying the truth and detecting patterns of deception. So he uses a numerograph, and he says that lying causes an emotional change within the subject, right? And we can see that in someone's, or we can measure that in their breathing rate. In 1915, William Marston, who's an American attorney, he invents an early lie detector using our systolic blood pressure, and that's one part of the test that we still use today. And the idea of lie detection catches on quickly in the US. So the polygraph basically records changes in our physiological processes. So our heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, and electrical resistance. And the idea is that when we lie, we get nervous about it, and that causes changes in our physiology. Our heart rate increases, our blood pressure goes up, our breathing rhythms change, and our perspiration increases. So what we do is we determine a baseline by asking you truthful questions, okay? Truthful questions we know the answer to. And they're generally yes/no questions, right? Deviations from the baseline are then taken as signs of lying. So there's three basic approaches here. We use a control question test. We compare questions to responses to irrelevant questions. We don't often use this in a forensic setting because even innocent people, right? If you were being questioned or interrogated by the police, you're likely to be nervous and anxious even if you're innocent. There's a directed lie test where we tell a subject to lie on purpose, and we compare that to when they tell the truth. And then there's a guilty knowledge test, okay? And this is comparing responses to multiple choice questions, one of which contains the information only known to the investigator and the offender who would know. So like if pictures of weapons are flashed on a computer screen, the perpetrator would be expected to recognize the weapon used in the crime. When that's then processed by our brain, it should produce a recognition response. And we should see that in our nervous system and our I think that's supposed to say electrical responses, not electoral like an election. Now, one thing to know, most people do have these reactions when they lie, okay? But some people don't have any physiological response when they lie, right? So people who, are psychopaths, they're not going to have that response. You can also practice and learn how to beat the test. The test will also show if you were questioned by someone to whom you're sexually attracted, right? It will pop up as though you're lying, right? Because your blood pressure is going to change, your heart rate's going to change, right? You're going to have those same physiological reactions. And a lot of the conclusions end up just being based on like what's someone's demeanor, right? What's their attitude while they're being questioned. There's no physiological response that is uniquely associated with lying. We don't really know which brain mechanisms are actually used or involved with lying. And it's difficult to tell truth tellers from liars. There's some research that looks at like police officers who think they have a lot of experience and can tell when someone's lying. And they're not. They're actually not any better than regular people from telling when someone's lying. So polygraphs are not admissible in court because they're not reliable. They don't meet those scientific standards to be admitted as evidence. And in 1998, a case U.S. v. Sheffer really emphasizes that poor reliability. What about hypnosis as an investigative tool? Okay, so in the late 18th century, Mesmer is experimenting with what he calls magnetic healing. Marquis Dupuy, whatever his last name is, developed the theory of mesmerism and coined the term artificial somnambulism. Okay, this is a peaceful sleep-like trance. It's being under hypnosis. Okay, so in 1819 in Europe, DeFaria discovers the perfect crisis, a somnambulistic sleep state in which patients carry out the commands of the magnetizer. Okay, and upon reawakening, have no memory of having done so. Okay, this really emphasizes the importance of the will of the subject. In 1943, Braid describes a state of a nervous sleep called hypnotism. Right, so this is all the same thing, just described in different ways. So others start using hypnosis to study hysteria and discover that under hypnosis, one can reproduce hysterical phenomena such as amnesia or anesthesia. So hypnosis is used in two broad areas today. One is to help enhance someone's memory, to uncover memories associated with criminal trauma. And one called hypno-investigations. These are interrogations and interviews using hypnosis. And this was popular a while ago, not so much today. And the idea here is that when an individual suffers severe trauma, they may dissociate. So while hypnosis can increase the number of correct responses, it also increases the number of incorrect responses. There's a huge trend in the 80s of patients undergoing hypnosis to find these repressed memories where then they're accusing people in their family, loved ones, of sexual assault, much of which did not actually happen. So there's a lot of research that tells us hypnosis does not improve the accuracy of memory. So things that courts have said, hey, these are problems with hypnosis, okay? 1, a person undergoing hypnosis is more susceptible to suggestion, right? Have you guys ever seen, these were popular when I was in college, there'd be like these comedians who would put people under hypnosis and get them to do funny things, right? Get them to believe like they're a superhero, and then like they run around the room trying to save people, right? So you're susceptible to suggestion, which means whatever memories I'm recovering might be suggested by me. A hypnotized person may confabulate, right? So they're going to use that to fill in gaps in our memory. It leads to memory hardening. It makes us believe that we're more confident in the facts that we remembered. And after hypnosis, we may lose the ability to assess that memory critically. To say like, oh, did that really happen? Or is it a dream? Or is it something else? Now, 2/3 of states say that hypnotically refreshed testimony is inadmissible. Some allow it under most circumstances, and some take a middle ground approach. Basically, the psychologist has to be experienced in the use of hypnosis and be qualified as an expert witness. They should be independent and not regularly employed by the prosecution, investigator, or defense. Any information given to the hypnotist by law enforcement or defense must be recorded in writing. Hypnotists should obtain from the subject a detailed description of the facts as they remember them. All contacts by the hypnotist and the subject have to be recorded, and only the hypnotist and the subject should be present in the sessions. In 1987, the Supreme Court endorsed this middle ground approach. There's no empirical evidence that says I can hypnotize you and make you do a criminal act, okay? Now, hypnosis has been used to, has been associated with multiple personality defenses, which today is called dissociative identity disorder. Kenneth Bianchi is one of the, oh my God, I just forgot what his name is. He's a serial killer, and he's not, it's not Green River. Oh, this is gonna bug me. Okay, sorry guys. He is a serial killer operating with his cousin Angelo Buono, sorry. And he tries to fake multiple personalities during his psych eval in order to basically be found not responsible. And during this third psych eval, he gets caught. So it's interesting, right? He's being observed, and even trained professionals don't realize he's faking it. And basically, what happens is during the third psych eval, they're getting a little like, we're not sure Ken Bianchi is really telling us the truth. So the psychiatrist tells him that multiple personalities usually involve more than just 2. And so then when they put him under hypnosis, he produces a third one and then 2 more. So basically, busted. Now, one thing we can use is cognitive interviews, right? These are designed to fully immerse someone in a partially recalled situation using freedom of description. So they're instructed to report everything they can think of. They're asked to reconstruct the incident, including how they're feeling and reactions. It encourages free recall. It asks people to recall the events in different orders, right? So usually when someone has practiced lying, right, they've practiced it in one order, like chronological order, which means they often can't repeat it in a different order. But if something genuinely happened to you, you can usually repeat it in different orders. Okay? You've probably seen this if you watch Criminal Minds. You've probably seen this, right? They'll talk about cognitive interviews. They might ask you to, like, close your eyes, describe where you are. So it encourages less interruption, right? And it asks the person, instead of being guided by a police officer who has very specific questions he wants answers to, we're asked to just recall things. How did the person look? Did they have any tattoos? Right? To kind of engage in free recall. It's also not uncommon for people to recall things hours or days after being interviewed, right? So you get interviewed by someone, right? You give your account, right? And then sometimes when we start to think about something, right? This happens with just general memories we have. We remember pieces we didn't think about at the moment. Now, sometimes cognitive interviews can increase the amount of correct information, but also it can increase the number of errors and our brain's desire to fill in pieces we don't remember. Now, even trained investigators tend to place too much confidence in these interviews. There's a lot of long-held beliefs about how does the suspect behave when they're being questioned that we don't have any empirical, we have no scientific research to support it. As I told you, there's no ability of some people to tell truth tellers from liars. And even people who undergo training to be able to do that, they're generally less accurate, more confident, and more biased. Profiling. Okay, so in 1932, the Psychiatric Clinic of the Court of General Sessions in New York begins to classify each offender according to a personality evaluation consisting of 4 categories: the presence or absence of psychosis, how intellectual they are, the presence of psychopathic or neurotic features and personality disorders, and their physical condition. And in 1932, from 1932 to 1965, Bellevue Hospital is conducting a study that indicates that personality and, quote, the external realities of mental life are more involved in criminal behavior than psychoses or defective intelligence. In the 60s, it becomes obvious that the systems for describing, classifying, and cataloging behavioral elements of criminal offenders is necessary. So one thing we often look at when we're classifying crimes is the modus operandi, or the MO, okay? These are functional components that are necessary to successfully commit a crime. These are things like time of day. A person only attacks at night, or only attacks during the day. Do they have preferred types of locations or types of victims? How do they gain entry? What kind of tools do they use? Because MO is generally consistent, we can use that to link multiple crimes, right? This is a thing that we use in order to link serial killings together. Now, MOs can be static or dynamic. Static meaning they don't change, dynamic meaning they do change. Okay? And criminals will tweak their MO to meet changing demands of their crime. Now, another thing we see in repeat offenders is a signature. This is behavior that's not necessary to commit the crime, but it's necessary for the offender, for their psychology, for their psychological needs. Okay? This is generally stable over time, and we should see it at each crime scene. These are generally symbolic, and they hold significance to the offender. And they might not be understood by anybody but the offender. Ritual is a combination of fantasy and motivational factors. They fulfill a need for the offender, and that might not be necessary to actually commit the crime. So you could successfully commit the crime without the ritual, but it's something that the offender needs. So this could be bindings, posing a victim, and it can also help link crime scenes together. And then you also want to watch out for staging. So this is when an offender purposely alters the crime scene before the police arrive in order to obscure the motive, right? To make it not look like it's connected to other things. Now, we have a variety of different types of profiling. Criminal psychological profiling is what you're most familiar with. This is where we analyze behavioral patterns at crime scenes, and it helps us figure out characteristics of who the offender likely is. This could be like their sex, their marital status, whether or not they have a job. Now, non-scientific profiling, and by the way, most profiling is more art than science, relies on intuition, investigative experience, and professional judgment. Whereas scientific profiling is relying on past research. Offenders who do this are most likely this. So let's look at these non-scientific models, okay? Most of the models that have been developed by the FBI, they're not scientific, okay? It's an intuitive analysis of crime scene evidence. It also often really emphasizes what we know about the victims and then what we conclude about the offender by what we know about the victims. This includes things like physical traits, marital status, medical history, prior involvement with the criminal justice system. Okay, so what the FBI uses, they've moved towards more scientific profiling today, but it's really not based in science. Those profiles, right, if you watch Mindhunter, the profiles and information that the FBI has based most of their conclusions on is based on a study of 36 offenders. That's it, 36 offenders. Now, the only model that's scientific is the Cantor model. This stresses the importance of linking behavior, personalities, and other human characteristics. So in order to have a scientific-based model, you have to have a reliable relationship between actions and offender characteristics. Now, one thing that makes this a challenge and makes it difficult is that we don't have a lot of serial killers. It seems like we have a lot, right? But compared to like thieves or other crimes, we don't have a lot. So it makes it harder to study them. We can also only study the ones that we know about, right? So maybe the ones who never get caught are very different. So the offender consistency hypothesis assumes there's consistencies in the way an offender carries out a crime, right? So every time I carry it out, there must be some similarities that then reflect characteristics that I have. Now, the offender specialty hypothesis is when offenders' crimes become specialized to the point where social processes, preparedness, impulsiveness, and reactionary features can be identified. Now, there hasn't been a lot of research looking at profiling, and mostly the stuff you know about profiling are the successful cases, okay? But the FBI has gotten it wrong quite a bit. And that concludes investigations.